James Carter was 72 years old, but the weight of his years didn't show in his posture. He sat in a weathered wooden chair outside Fulton's barbershop on North Fulton Street, Baltimore, his back straight as a rifle barrel, his eyes tracing the slow dance of a sycamore leaf falling to the cracked sidewalk. The chair, splintered and leaning slightly left, was as much a part of the street as the fire hydrant or the faded murals on the corner store. Nobody touched it, not because it was sacred, but because it belonged to James. And James, with his quiet gaze and calloused hands, belonged to a time this city had half forgotten. He wore a faded olive-green cap, the words Combat Medic, Vietnam 1971 stitched in white thread, now gray from decades of sun and sweat. His right hand rested on a cane, its handle carved with the faint outline of a caduceus, a gift from a soldier he'd saved in Khe Sanh. His left hand held a small plastic pillbox, the kind you get from a VA pharmacy, its rattle a reminder of the heart condition he'd ignored until last month's hospital stay. James didn't talk much, not about the war, not about the wife he'd buried 20 years ago, not about the son who'd left for D.C. to fight battles of a different kind. His silence wasn't cold, it was heavy, like the air before a storm. The street hummed with Friday afternoon life, kids shouting over a basketball game, a delivery truck idling, the clippers buzzing inside the barbershop. James watched it all, his face unreadable but not empty. He'd seen worse than chaos, he'd stitched men together under mortar fire, carried a dying boy 4 kilometers through jungle mud, and come home to a country that spat on his uniform. Baltimore was home now, not because it loved him back, but because it was where he'd raised Daniel, where he'd held his wife, Lena, as she slipped away from cancer. This chair, this sidewalk, was where he sat to remember, and to be seen. Ryan Wheeler didn't see any of that. At 32, he was all sharp edges and restless energy, his police uniform crisp, his badge glinting like it was the only thing holding him together. He stepped out of his patrol car, a half-empty energy drink in hand, his high-end tight haircut catching the sun. Ryan had been on the force for 5 years, long enough to feel untouchable, not long enough to know what it cost. He'd grown up hearing his mother, Margaret, talk about her days as an army nurse, about the father he barely remembered, a Vietnam draftee who drank himself to death when Ryan was 10. Those stories left him bitter, not proud. Veterans, to him, were relics, men who clung to old wars like excuses. Ryan's eyes locked on James, then the chair. Something about its permanence, its defiance of the city's churn, set his jaw tight. He crossed the street, boots clicking, his stride more performance than purpose. "This your throne, old man," he said, loud enough for the kids across the street to pause their game. James didn't look up, his gaze still on the leaf now resting by his foot. Ryan's smirk faltered, then hardened. "I'm talking to you. You think you own this sidewalk?" Inside the barbershop, the buzzing stopped. A few heads turned, but nobody moved. James's cane tapped once, softly, against the pavement, as if grounding himself. Ryan stepped closer, his shadow falling over James's cap. "Combat medic, huh?" he scoffed, reading the stitching. "Bet you're a real hero. Save the world, right?" He pulled a small can of blue spray paint from his belt, the kind used to mark evidence scenes, and shook it, the rattle cutting through the street's hum like a warning shot. Sarah Nguyen, 21, a nursing student with a backpack slung over one shoulder, slowed her walk across the street. Her phone was already out, not because she expected trouble, but because she'd learned to document everything. Her parents, Vietnamese immigrants, had taught her that. She hit record, her hands steady despite the knot in her stomach. Ryan raised the can, his voice dropping to a snarl. "Let's make you a monument, then." The hiss of paint was sharp, unnatural, as blue streaked across James's cap, his gray hair, his forehead. It dripped down his temple, pooling in the creases of his skin, the smell of chemicals biting the air. James didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the paint were just rain, as if Ryan were just another storm he'd weathered. The crowd grew, kids, shopkeepers, a delivery driver clutching his clipboard. Gasps rippled, but nobody stepped forward. Sarah's phone trembled slightly, but she kept filming, her breath shallow. Ryan stepped back, grinning, the can still in hand. "There," he said. "Now your art." He turned to the crowd, expecting laughter, approval, anything. He got silence. A young woman burst from the barbershop, her apron flapping. "He just got out of the hospital," she shouted, pointing at the faded medical bracelet on James's wrist. "What's wrong with you?" Ryan's grin froze, his eyes darting to the phones now raised around him. Sarah's video captured it all, the paint, the cane, the bracelet, James's unmoving face. James's cane slipped from his hand, hitting the pavement with a dry crack. The sound wasn't loud, but it landed like a gunshot in the quiet. The carved caduceus split, one half rolling into the gutter. Ryan laughed, a short, nervous bark, and kicked the broken piece aside. "Guess you don't need that anymore, hero." Sarah's video ended there, her thumb shaking as she stopped recording. She didn't know James's name, didn't know his story, but she knew what she'd seen wasn't just wrong, it was a wound, deep and deliberate. As Ryan swaggered back to his car, the crowd's silence followed him, heavy with something more than anger, judgment. James sat still, paint drying on his skin, his cap ruined, his chair suddenly looking smaller under the weight of what had just been done. Inside, James felt the sting of the paint, the ache of his heart, the memory of Lena's voice telling him to keep standing. He didn't move, not because he couldn't, but because he'd learned long ago that some battles are won by staying still. The street resumed its hum, but it wasn't the same. Something had broken, and something else had begun. Sarah Nguyen's fingers hovered over her phone, the video still open, its final frame frozen on James Carter's paint-streaked face. She sat on a bus heading back to her dorm, the city blurring past, her heart pounding like she'd just run a mile. She titled the clip, "Cop Defaces Veteran," and uploaded it to her blog, a modest site she'd started for her nursing classes, where she wrote about healthcare and her grandparents' stories from Vietnam. Her caption was short, unpolished, "This happened today. He's a veteran. Why?" She hit post at 4:32 p.m., not expecting more than a few shares from her classmates. By 7 p.m., the video had 3 million views. Back at his row house, James Carter stood in his small bathroom, the mirror fogged from the hot water he'd poured into the sink. The blue paint had dried, crusting his hair, staining his skin at his temples, a faint streak running down his cheek like a tear he'd never shed. He dipped a washcloth into the water, scrubbing gently, his movements slow, as if each stroke pulled at something deeper than his skin. The cloth turned blue, then gray, but the stain lingered, faint, like the scars on his arms from shrapnel in Khe Sanh. He paused, meeting his own eyes in the mirror, seeing Lena's face instead, her smile, her hands folding his uniform before he left for Vietnam, her voice whispering, "Come back to me, James." She hadn't lived to see this day, and for that, he was grateful. The room was quiet, save for the drip of the faucet and the distant hum of a neighbor's TV. James's pillbox sat on the sink, a reminder of the heart bypass he'd had 3 weeks ago. He hadn't told anyone, not the barbershop regulars, not the VA nurse, not even Daniel himself, who was off in D.C., buried in his work. James had always carried his pain alone, from the jungle nights when he'd stitched boys together with trembling hands, to the years after, when he'd cleaned hospital floors while white veterans got desk jobs. The paint was just another weight, another test of endurance. Across town, Ryan sat in the precinct locker room, his uniform jacket tossed over a bench, his phone buzzing with notifications he ignored. He cracked open another energy drink, the hiss echoing in the empty room. "Told that old guy who's boss," he said to Officer Jenkins, who was lacing up his boots. Jenkins grunted, avoiding Ryan's eyes. Ryan leaned back, smirking. "You see his face? Didn't even blink. Probably too old to care." His laugh was sharp, but it didn't land. Jenkins stood, muttering something about paperwork, and left. Ryan's smirk faded, his fingers tapping the can, restless. He didn't check his phone, didn't see the comments piling up under Sarah's video. Disgusting. Who is this cop? That man's a hero. The video had hit X like a spark on dry tinder. By 9 p.m., it was trending with hashtag veteran defaced and hashtag Baltimore cop. News outlets picked it up, CNN ran a breaking news ticker, local stations looped the clip, blurring James's face but not the paint or the cane's crack. Sarah's blog crashed from the traffic, her inbox flooded with messages, support, threats, interview requests. She sat at her desk, stunned, her roommate urging her to turn off her phone. "You started something big, Sarah," her roommate said. Sarah shook her head, eyes on the screen. "I just wanted someone to see him." At the precinct, the captain called an emergency meeting. Ryan stood at the back, arms crossed, as the lieutenant played the video on a projector. The room was silent, officers shifting in their seats, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "This is a PR nightmare," the captain said, his voice tight. "Wheeler, you're on desk duty until we sort this out." Ryan's jaw clenched. He was loitering, "Sir. I followed protocol." The captain's eyes narrowed. "You painted a veteran's head, Wheeler. That's not in any manual." Murmurs rippled through the room, and Ryan felt the weight of their stares, not anger, but distance, like he'd crossed a line they wouldn't follow. James sat in his living room, the TV off, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. A framed photo of Lena sat on the mantel, her smile frozen in 1995, before the cancer took her. Next to it was a folded flag from his service, never displayed, and a small box of medals he hadn't opened in decades. He held the broken cane in his lap, his thumb tracing the split caduceus. The crack wasn't just wood, it was 1971, the night he dragged 7 boys to safety, their blood soaking his boots. It was 1973, when he came home to jeers at the airport. It was every "no" he'd heard at job interviews, every glance that said he didn't belong. The paint wasn't new. It was just brighter. His phone buzzed, a voicemail from Daniel. James didn't listen, knowing his son's tone would break him. Daniel had always been the fighter, the one who argued, who believed in systems James had stopped trusting. But James didn't want a fight. He wanted to sit here, in this chair, and let the world move on. He closed his eyes, hearing the jungle's hum, Lena's laugh, the hiss of paint. The room felt smaller, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. Outside, the city wasn't moving on. Protesters gathered at the barbershop, holding signs with James's face, his cap clear in the grainy video stills. Hashtags multiplied, hashtag justice for James, hashtag honor veterans. Sarah's video had done more than expose Ryan, it had woken something in Baltimore, a city tired of seeing its elders dismissed. By midnight, the clip had 12 million views, and James Carter's name, spoken by a reporter, then a protester, then a stranger, was spreading, not as a victim, but as something older, something harder to ignore. Daniel Carter stepped off the train at Baltimore's Penn Station, his charcoal suit sharp against the evening's gray. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who'd spent years navigating rooms where words were weapons. His face was calm, but his eyes, dark, steady, inherited from James, burned with purpose. He'd seen Sarah Nguyen's video at 3 a.m., his phone lighting up his D.C. apartment. The image of his father, paint-streaked and still, had gutted him, not just for the act but for the years he'd spent away, believing distance would protect them both. He'd booked the first train, leaving his Pentagon contacts untouched, until now. The precinct on 6th Street buzzed with tension, officers moving like they were bracing for a storm. Ryan Wheeler sat at a desk, relegated to paperwork, his badge still pinned but his confidence fraying. He'd ignored the captain's orders to stay off his phone, scrolling through X posts that called him a disgrace, a coward. His jaw twitched, but he kept his smirk, muttering to himself, "They'll forget this in a week." The other officers kept their distance, their radios crackling with routine calls, but the air felt heavier, like the precinct itself was waiting for judgment. Daniel entered without announcement, his steps measured, his briefcase unadorned. The desk sergeant, a wiry man named Torres, looked up, ready to bark about visitor protocols, but something in Daniel's posture, straight, unyielding, like a soldier at parade rest, made him pause. "Can I help you, sir?" Torres asked, his voice softer than intended. Daniel's eyes met his, calm but piercing. "I'm here about James Carter. The officer who sprayed him is still on duty." It wasn't a question, it was a fact, laid bare. Torres blinked, glancing at the security monitor, but Daniel was already moving toward the internal hallway, as if he knew the layout by heart. Heads turned, officers, clerks, a janitor mopping the floor. Daniel didn't raise his voice, didn't flash a credential, but his presence filled the space like a shadow cast too long. He stopped at the captain's office, the door half open, and knocked once, sharp. Captain Ruiz, a stocky man with graying temples, looked up from a stack of reports, his face tight from the day's fallout. "Who are you?" he asked, standing. "Daniel Carter," Daniel said, his voice low, deliberate. "James Carter's son. Formerly with the Department of Defense, Policy Analysis Division. I'm here to ensure Officer Wheeler's actions aren't buried under your desk." Ruiz's eyes widened, recognizing the weight of the title, the unspoken threat behind it. Daniel set his briefcase on the desk, clicking it open to reveal a single folder, its edges crisp. "This is a preliminary file on your officer's conduct history. 3 infractions, 2 civilian complaints, 1 unreported use of force incident. You'll find it matches your internal records, if you check." Ruiz hesitated, then took the folder, flipping through pages marked with dates and signatures. Daniel didn't move, his gaze steady, like he'd already won battles in rooms like this. Flashbacks flickered in his mind, 1998, sitting at the kitchen table, watching his mother, Lena, bandage James's hand after a bar fight, her voice soft but firm. "You don't fight hate with fists, Daniel. You fight with your head." He'd been 18 then, angry at the world for his father's silence, vowing to change it. Georgetown had given him the tools, the Pentagon the platform, but he'd resigned in 2016, sick of seeing veterans like his father forgotten in budget cuts. Now, standing here, he felt the weight of that promise, and the years he'd failed to keep it. "Wheeler's on leave pending review," Ruiz said, his voice cautious. "We're handling this internally." Daniel's lips curved slightly, not a smile but a challenge. "Internally? Your officer defaced a Vietnam veteran, my father, who saved 7 lives in Khe Sanh. The video's got 15 million views. This isn't internal anymore." He leaned forward, just enough. "I have contacts at the DOJ, VA, and 3 Senate offices. I don't want to use them. But I will, unless Wheeler's badge is off his chest by tomorrow." The room stilled, the hum of the precinct fading. Ruiz's radio crackled, but he ignored it. "You're threatening me?" he asked, but his tone lacked heat. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "I'm offering you a chance to act before this becomes your legacy stain too." He closed the briefcase, the click echoing like a gavel. "My father sat still while your officer painted him. I won't." Ruiz exhaled, glancing at the folder, then at Daniel, whose presence seemed to shrink the room. "I'll escalate it to IA," he said finally. "Wheeler's suspended, effective now." Daniel nodded once, not in thanks, but acknowledgement, and turned to leave. As he passed the bullpen, Ryan caught sight of him, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Who's that?" he muttered to an officer nearby, who shrugged, eyes fixed on Daniel's back. Outside, Daniel stood under the precinct's sodium lights, his phone buzzing with a voice message from James. He didn't play it, knowing his father's voice would crack his resolve. Instead, he remembered 2005, the hospital room where Lena died, James holding her hand, whispering, "I'll keep him safe, Lena." Daniel had been 25, promising his mother he'd protect his father, too. He'd failed then, buried in DC's bureaucracy, but not now. The city's pulse thrummed around him, sirens, horns, the distant chant of protesters gathering at the barbershop. The video had woken Baltimore, and Daniel would ensure it didn't sleep again. Inside, Ryan sat, his pen frozen mid-signature, the precinct's quiet louder than any reprimand. He didn't know Daniel's name yet, but he felt the shift, like a tide turning against him. The officers' glances weren't camaraderie now, they were caution, as if he were a fuse already lit. Daniel's words lingered, not loud, but heavy, like his father's silence, a verdict that didn't need a courtroom to be felt. The Baltimore streets pulsed with anger, a crowd swelling outside the 6th Street precinct by dawn, their signs scrawled with "Justice for James" and #Honor Not Paint. The air crackled with chants, a rhythm born of a city that had seen too many wounds ignored. Sarah Nguyen, still shaken from the video's viral explosion, stood at the crowd's edge, her phone now a weight in her pocket. Her blog post, a raw plea titled "Those Eyes Deserve Better," had been shared by 5 million, her words striking a nerve. He didn't move, didn't fight back, just sat there with eyes that held more than I'll ever understand. News vans lined the block, cameras panning the protest, but Sarah's focus stayed on James Carter's image projected on a makeshift screen, a still from her video, his paint-streaked cap unbowed. Inside his row house, James sat by the window, the blinds half-drawn, the TV muted. The protest's distant roar reached him, but he didn't look out. His broken cane rested on the table, its split caduceus catching the light. The paint was gone from his skin, but its sting lingered, not in his flesh but in memory. 1973, stepping off the bus in Memphis, his uniform spat on by a stranger. 1980, being turned away from a factory job, the manager's smirk saying "Veteran don't mean much here." The world's outrage was new, but its indifference was old. He sipped coffee, his hands steady, thinking of Lena's voice. "You don't owe them your pain, James. You owe them your truth." At the precinct, Ryan Wheeler sat in a back office, his badge removed, his uniform traded for a plain shirt that felt like defeat. The captain had suspended him pending a full review, Daniel Carter's folder still on the desk like a guillotine. Ryan's phone was off, but he'd seen enough before the blackout, ex-posts branding him a disgrace, memes of his face captioned "Painter." His bravado was gone, replaced by a gnawing panic. "I was just doing my job," he'd told the internal affairs officer, but the words sounded thin, even to him. His colleagues avoided him, their radios a low hum, as if the precinct itself was holding its breath. The video's reach grew, hitting 30 million views by noon, hashtags like #James1971 and #VeteranHonor trending globally. A retired Army archivist in Virginia, moved by a Reddit thread, dug into military records and posted a bombshell, a 1972 Silver Star nomination for James Carter, buried under a note citing insufficient documentation. The document detailed his actions in Key San, dragging 7 soldiers to safety under fire, his own hands torn by shrapnel. The revelation spread, fueling protests and editorials. How many Jameses have we erased? The leak exposed not just negligence but a pattern of racial bias in military honors, turning James's silence into a national accusation. Sarah's blog became a hub for the movement, her inbox flooded with stories from veterans ignored by the system. She posted a follow-up, her voice stronger now. "James Carter is every elder we've walked past, every story we didn't ask for. His silence is our shame." Her words were read on MSNBC, quoted by a senator calling for a VA audit. Sarah, overwhelmed, sat in her dorm, wondering if she'd done enough, her grandparents' refugee stories echoing in her resolve to keep James's name alive. Meanwhile, Ryan's past unraveled. An anonymous tip to a local reporter revealed he'd dodged a 2001 draft call-up using his father's veteran ID, claiming a hardship exemption. The Baltimore Sun ran the headline, "Officer who defaced veteran hid behind stolen valor." The leak included a scanned form, Ryan's signature clear, a lie buried for years. His mother, Margaret Wheeler, saw the news at her retirement home, her hands shaking as she read. She'd known but stayed silent, hoping Ryan would grow into the man his father hadn't been. Now, guilt gnawed at her, she'd failed them both. Ryan paced his apartment, the walls closing in. His phone, back on, buzzed with threats and messages from old friends who'd cut ties. He tried to post a statement on X, claiming he'd been provoked, but the comments drowned him out. Liar. Coward. He deleted it, his hands trembling, the smirk gone. Flashbacks hit him, his mother's stories of Vietnam, his father's drunken rants about heroes who left him to die. Ryan had hated those stories, hated the shadow of men like James Carter. Now that shadow loomed, inescapable, as the city outside chanted a name he'd tried to erase. James stood, moving to the mantel where Lena's photo sat. He touched the frame, his thumb brushing her smile. The protests were for him, they said, but he didn't feel it. He felt 1971, the weight of boys lives in his hands, 2005, Lena's last breath, 2025, a can's hiss, a crowd's silence. He didn't want their anger. He wanted them to see what he'd always seen, a world that forgets its debts. His phone buzzed again, Daniel, leaving another voicemail. James didn't listen, not yet. He sat back down, the cane in his lap, its crack a reminder that some things don't break clean. Outside, the protests grew, candles lit at the barbershop where James's chair stood empty, a vigil for a man who hadn't asked for one. Sarah joined the crowd, her phone off, her eyes on the chair, it splintered wood, a monument to silence that spoke louder than any megaphone. The nation was waking, but James Carter's truth, quiet, heavy, unyielding, was what kept it from looking away. The courtroom on Charles Street was stark, its fluorescent lights casting no warmth on the oak benches or the faces filling them. James Carter sat in the front row, his coat folded over one arm, his shoes polished but worn at the heels. At 72, he carried himself with a stillness that made the room feel smaller, his eyes fixed not on the defendant's table but on the empty space where justice was meant to stand. Ryan Wheeler, 32, sat rigid in a ill-fitting suit, his badge gone, his hands clasped to hide their tremor. The hearing wasn't a trial, not yet, but a disciplinary review, a public reckoning for the paint he'd sprayed on James's head now etched into the nation's memory. Margaret Wheeler, 68, entered quietly, her steps measured, her Army nurse badge from 1974 pinned to her cardigan. She'd driven from her retirement home in Annapolis, her hands gripping the wheel as memories flooded back, Vietnam, the smell of blood, the man who'd seen saving her husband under fire. She hadn't spoken to Ryan in months, not since the video surfaced, her silence a mix of shame and grief for the son she'd raised but couldn't reach. She stood in the gallery, unnoticed until she stepped to the witness stand, her voice steady but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. "I was an Army nurse in Laos, 1971, Margaret began, her eyes on Ryan, who looked down, unable to meet them. "I served with James Carter. He carried my husband, Charles Wheeler, for kilometers to our hospital tent, under enemy fire, barefoot, his hands torn open by shrapnel." She paused, her throat tight, the courtroom silent except for the faint scratch of a reporter's pen. Charles was presumed dead, no medevac, no hope. James didn't stop. "He saved my husband's life, gave me the chance to raise my son." Her gaze hardened, landing on Ryan. "And you, Ryan, sprayed paint on the man who saved your father." The words landed like a thunderclap, not loud but deep, shaking the room. Ryan's head snapped up, his face draining of color, his mouth opening but no sound emerging. Flashbacks flickered through Margaret's mind, 1972, Charles's haunted eyes recounting James's heroism, 2003, Ryan at 10, asking why his dad drank so much, 2015, her silence when Ryan joined the police, hoping he'd find purpose. She'd shielded him from his father's flaws, never telling him the debt their family owed James. Now, that silence was her failure, and Ryan's shame was its fruit. A murmur ran through the crowd, but James remained still, his hands folded over his broken cane, its split caduceus hidden in his coat pocket. He didn't look at Margaret, didn't need to. He remembered her, young, steady hands in a blood-soaked tent, her voice calming him as he stitched a boy's chest. He'd never asked after Charles, assuming he'd lived or died quietly. Now, hearing her words, he felt no vindication, only the weight of another wound, the kind no bandage could close. The judge, a woman with gray-streaked hair, leaned forward, her gavel untouched. "Ms. Wheeler," she said, "are you stating this under oath?" Margaret nodded, her badge glinting under the lights. "I am. I never told Ryan because I thought he'd learn to honor men like James on his own. I was wrong." Her voice cracked, not from doubt but from the cost of truth. She stepped down, returning to her seat, her hands trembling as she smoothed her cardigan, as if to steady herself. Ryan's lawyer, a young man in a cheap suit, stood, stammering about relevance, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. The room's focus shifted to James, who stood, unprompted, his movements slow but deliberate, like a ritual. He approached the table, not for drama but because the moment demanded it. From his pocket, he drew a small, tarnished medallion, a medic's emblem, engraved with Key San, 1971. He placed it on the table, its dull clink louder than any speech. "This don't mean nothing now," he said, his voice low, steady, like gravel underfoot. "I carried it for a country I believed in. I don't know what it's worth anymore." He sat down, the medallion gleaming faintly, an accusation not of Ryan but of everyone who'd let it gather dust. The room froze, the air thick with the weight of his words. Ryan's shoulders slumped, his hands now openly shaking, his eyes darting to the medallion, to his mother, to the crowd that saw him not as an officer but as a man undone. He tried to speak, but his throat closed, the smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Margaret watched her son, her heart twisting, but she didn't move to him. She'd failed Charles by hiding his pain, failed Ryan by hiding his father's debt. Now, she owed James the truth, even if it broke her family. Flashbacks showed her in 1971, watching James carry Charles in, his hands bleeding, his eyes fierce with purpose. 1985, Charles's funeral, Ryan too young to understand. 2025, this courtroom, her son's silence louder than her own confession. The hearing adjourned, but nobody left immediately. Reporters scribbled furiously, but the crowd stayed seated, as if leaving would diminish what they'd witnessed. James walked out first, his coat over his arm, his steps unhurried. He didn't look at Ryan, didn't acknowledge Margaret's tearful glance. He'd carried too many burdens to add their guilt to his load. Outside, the protests had quieted, but candles still burned by the barbershop chair, a vigil for a man whose silence had become a nation's voice. Ryan remained, his lawyer whispering strategy, but he didn't hear it. He saw the medallion in his mind, small but heavy, like the truth he'd never known, now crushing him under its weight. Margaret left alone, her badge a reminder of a debt she'd never repay, but one she'd carry forward, teaching others what she'd failed to teach her son, that honor isn't worn, it's earned, and some debts are paid in silence, not applause. The morning after the hearing, Daniel Carter stood in a quiet Pentagon annex, a manila folder in hand, its contents heavier than the oak table before him. At 42, his face was a map of resolve, each line etched by years of fighting for truths buried in red tape. He'd submitted Memorandum 67B to the Department of Defense, a 94-page demand for recognition of his father, James Carter, and thousands of other veterans whose honors were denied by bias or neglect. The room held 3 VA officials and a DoD liaison, their faces tight, but Daniel's voice was calm, unyielding. "This isn't about medals," he said, sliding the folder forward. "It's about a system that forgot what it owes." The memorandum detailed James's 1972 Silver Star nomination, stalled by a racist officer's note, alongside 1,200 similar cases, names, dates, citations erased. Daniel's connections, forged during his Pentagon years, ensured it reached the right desks, but his restraint, learned from James, kept it from becoming a spectacle. Flashbacks flickered. 2016, Daniel resigning after a VA budget cut ignored his report on veteran suicides. 2005, his mother Lena's funeral, James whispering, "Don't fight for me, son. Fight for what lasts." Now, Daniel fought, not for glory, but for correction, his guilt for James's silence driving each word. Across Baltimore, the 6th Street precinct was a ghost of itself, officers moving under a cloud of scrutiny. Ryan Wheeler, now jobless, sat in his apartment, the blinds drawn, his badge and gun confiscated. The disciplinary hearing had stripped him of rank, the leaked draft-dodging papers sealing his fate. Ex-posts called him "painter," a slur that followed him like a shadow. He stared at his phone, its screen dark, replaying his mother Margaret's words, "James saved your father." Shame gnawed at him, not loud but constant, like a pulse he couldn't silence. He'd tried to call her, but she didn't answer, her silence a verdict heavier than any court's. The nation's pulse quickened, James's video now a staple in police training reforms. In Maryland, a new curriculum began with an 8-second clip, James, paint-stained, sitting unmoved. Recruits were asked to watch in silence, then write what humility meant in uniform. One cadet wrote, "It's knowing your badge don't make you bigger than the man you serve." The reform spread, precincts in 3 states adopting it, not as policy but as conscience, a shift sparked by a man who'd never raised his voice. Daniel's memorandum bore fruit. The DoD launched Operation Unseen Valor, a nationwide audit of denied honors, targeting cases like James's. VA offices opened revisit circles, where families shared stories, not for claims, but for recognition. In Chicago, a widow of a Korean War vet left one, clutching a photo, saying, "They said his name like it was theirs." The changes weren't perfect, some names stayed lost, but they were real, driven by people, not press releases, echoing James's quiet endurance. Ryan, adrift, wandered Baltimore's streets, avoiding the barbershop where James's chair stood, now a shrine of candles and notes. He'd lost friends, his union's backing, his sense of self. Flashbacks hit him. 2003, his father's slurred rants about Vietnam. 2015, his first arrest, the rush of power. 2025, the canes crack, the crowd's silence. He wanted to blame James, the video, the world, but Margaret's truth, "James saved you," left him nowhere to hide. He sat on a park bench, hands shaking, wondering if he could ever scrub clean the stain he'd left. James stayed home, the protests outside fading, but the candles by his door growing, left by strangers who'd seen his face on screens. He didn't read the news, didn't know his silver star was under review. He sat by Lena's photo, the broken cane in hand, its crack a reminder of what he'd carried, 7 lives in Key San, Lena's love, Daniel's future. He didn't want their pity. He wanted them to learn what he'd learned: dignity isn't given, it's held, even when the world tries to paint it away. Daniel left the Pentagon, his folder lighter but his resolve unchanged. He met a VA official in D.C., pushing for policy shifts, more funding for mental health, fewer bureaucratic denials. "Don't name it after my father," he said. "Just make it work." His mother's voice echoed, "Fight for what lasts." He was, not for James alone, but for every name buried like his. Outside, the city hummed, protests quieter now, but the change was louder, a ripple from one man's silence that refused to fade. James Carter stood at the edge of Greenmount Cemetery, the November wind biting through his worn coat. At 72, his steps were slow but steady, his cane, repaired with wood glue, the caduceus still split, tapping the frost-kissed grass. Lena's grave lay under a modest headstone, her name etched in simple font, Lena Carter, 1955 to 2005, beloved wife and mother. He knelt, brushing leaves from the stone, his hands rough from years of work and war. The cemetery was quiet, save for the distant hum of Baltimore, a city still reeling from the video that had made his face a symbol. He hadn't watched the news, hadn't read the X-posts or editorials calling him a hero. The protests, the candles by his door, the hashtags, #James1971, #HonorVeterans, felt like echoes of a fight he'd never asked for. He'd carried too much to care for applause. 1971, Key San, 7 boys saved, their blood on his hands. 1973, Memphis, his uniform spat on. 2005, Lena's hospital bed, her last smile, keep Daniel strong, James. The paint from Ryan Wheeler's can was gone, but its weight lingered, not on his skin but in his chest, where his heart, still healing from surgery, beat unevenly. He set a single daisy on Lena's grave, her favorite flower, picked from a corner store's bucket. "They're talking loud out there, Lena," he said, his voice low, like a secret shared with the wind. "But I don't know if they're hearing you." He paused, picturing her laugh, her hands folding his uniform before Vietnam, her eyes saying he'd come back. She'd believed in a world that held fast, but he'd seen it bend, through VA denials, job rejections, the paint's hiss. He didn't want their anger. He wanted them to see what she'd seen, a man who stood, not for glory, but for promises kept. Back home, the city stirred with change. Daniel's memorandum had sparked Operation Unseen Valor, auditing forgotten veterans' honors. Schools taught James's story in civics classes, not as a protest but as a lesson in humility. At the 6th Street precinct, recruits watched his video, learning silence before strength. James didn't know this, didn't need to. He sat on his porch, the repaired chair beside Lena's empty one, the cane across his lap, its crack a map of his life's fractures. That afternoon, a boy, no older than 8, ran up the street, his sneakers scuffed, a school uniform loose on his backpack. He stopped, staring at James, then held out a small bandage, its cartoon pattern bright. "Mister," he said, voice earnest, "you got a stain on your shirt. You okay?" He pointed to a faint blue speck on James's collar, a ghost of the paint. James looked down, his eyes softening, a smile breaking through, slow like dawn after a long night. He took the bandage, gentle. "Long time ago, son," he said. "Just something to remind me I'm still here." The boy nodded, satisfied, and ran back to his friends, their laughter bouncing off the rowhouses. James held the bandage, its smallness a weight against the years, Vietnam's mud, Lena's grave, the cane's fall. Flashbacks flickered, 1971, a wounded boy in Key San, whispering thanks as James tied a tourniquet, 1980, Daniel, 5, mimicking his dad's salute, 2025, the crowd's silence, heavier than Ryan's paint. The boy's gesture wasn't pity, it was innocence, seeing a man, not a symbol, and in that, it healed something James hadn't named. Daniel, in D.C., met with VA officials, his suit crisp, his voice steady. He pushed for mental health funding, streamlined honor reviews, no fanfare. "Don't name it after my father," he said, echoing Lena, "fight for what lasts." Flashbacks showed him at Lena's funeral, 23, vowing to protect James, 2016, resigning from the Pentagon, sick of bureaucracy. His guilt for James's silence drove him, but today felt different, less like a fight, more like a path. He left the meeting, his phone off, unaware of the boy's gesture, but feeling its echo in the city's quiet shift. James stayed on the porch, the bandage in his pocket, the cane in hand. The sun dipped, casting his shadow long, not sharp but steady, like a post marking where he'd stood. He didn't want the world's candles, their signs, their hashtags. He wanted them to learn what Lena taught him: dignity isn't shouted, it's lived, even when the world paints it blue. The boy's bandage, small and bright, was proof someone saw, not the hero, but the man. And for James, that was enough to keep sitting, to keep holding, to keep being. Baltimore's North Fulton Street was quiet this January morning, but the barbershop's empty chair, James Carter's chair, drew a steady stream of visitors. A hand-lettered sign hung from its armrest, reading, "This seat is for memory, not comfort." No one sat in it, but people paused, leaving notes, flowers, or a silent nod before moving on. Across the country, James's story had ignited a transformation, not loud with protests but deep, woven into policy and conscience. At 72, James remained at home, unaware his name was being carved into school auditoriums, his silence reshaping a nation. In Pittsburgh, a high school renamed its main hall, James Carter Hall, the bronze letters unveiled without fanfare. The plaque beneath, simple yet piercing, read, "Quiet strength taught us to listen." Students filed past, their civics teacher projecting Sarah Nguyen's video, James, paint-stained, unmoving, before asking, "What does dignity cost?" The discussion stretched into silence, a rarity for teenagers, but James's eyes in that frame demanded it. In Memphis, a VA clinic taped his photo to its reception desk, launching Revisit Circles, where families shared forgotten veteran stories. A widow in Minneapolis left one, clutching a dog tag, saying, "They spoke his name like it mattered." Daniel Carter, 42, worked in D.C., mentoring young veterans transitioning to teaching, his office sparse, his name absent from headlines. He'd declined interviews, awards, insisting his father's legacy needed no spotlight. "Don't teach what you survived," he told his ments, "teach what others shouldn't have to." Flashbacks haunted him. 2005, Lena's funeral, James's hand on his shoulder. 2016, his Pentagon resignation, vowing to protect James. Now, he pushed for VA reforms, mental health funding, honor audits, without fanfare, echoing Lena's charge, "Fight for what lasts." His phone stayed quiet, but he felt the nation's shift, a ripple from James's silence. Ryan Wheeler, 32, lived in obscurity, his apartment a dim refuge from a city that no longer saw him. Jobless, his badge gone, his name, Painter, was a scar he couldn't scrub. One evening, driven by a gnawing shame, he walked to James's row house, his shoes worn, hands buried in his pockets. The porch light was on, casting his shadow thin, unsteady. He knocked, hesitant, and James opened the door, his cane in hand, eyes steady but not cruel. "You got something to say?" James asked, voice low, like gravel underfoot. Ryan swallowed, his voice thin. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. For the paint, for everything." James studied him, the silence heavy, not forgiving but searching. "Sorry's a start," he said, stepping forward, the light catching his face. "But it ain't about me. It's about what you gave permission for, every eye that watched, every laugh you thought you'd get." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You don't need my forgiveness. You need to live with what you know now." The door closed softly, the light staying on, and Ryan stood, his shadow sharper, a warning he'd carry forward. Flashbacks hit Ryan. 2003, his father's drunken rants. 2025, his mother Margaret's courtroom truth. James saved him. He'd lost everything, job, friends, pride, but James's words planted something new, fragile, like accountability. He didn't return, but he began volunteering at a veterans' shelter, silent, earning no trust, just presence, a step toward a debt he'd never repay. Nationwide, James's influence grew without ceremony. Police departments in 5 states adopted training reforms, starting with his video, teaching recruits to pause before acting, to see the weight of a name. A small town in California dedicated a library wing, its sign reading, "James Carter, Room for Silence." No ribbon was cut, just a quiet unveiling, the librarian saying, "This isn't a tribute, it's a correction." Schools revised history texts, not with guilt but with truth, adding stories of veterans like James, erased by bias. James sat on his porch, the repaired cane in hand, the boy's bandage in his pocket, Lena's photo in his heart. He didn't know about the auditoriums, the libraries, the training clips. He knew the wind, the chairs creak, the city's hum. Flashbacks flickered. 1971, saving 7 lives. 1980, raising Daniel. 2025, a child's innocent gaze. He didn't want their buildings, he wanted their learning, a world that saw what he'd seen, duty, not applause. The candle by his door burned low, left by a passerby, its flame a quiet promise that someone, somewhere, was listening. The National Mall in Washington, D.C., gleamed under a crisp February sun, its expanse dotted with rows of chairs, a podium draped in navy blue, and a velvet box holding a Presidential Medal of Freedom. The stage was set to honor James Carter, 72, whose silence had reshaped a nation. News anchors buzzed, lawmakers adjusted their pins, and military brass stood at attention, their medals glinting. The crowd, thousands strong, held signs, #James 1971, honor earned. But the chair meant for James remained empty, a stark absence that spoke louder than any speech. Days earlier, the White House had called Daniel Carter, 42, offering the medal for his father. Daniel's voice, calm but firm, echoed James's restraint. "He doesn't need a medal," he said. "He needs a country that doesn't wait 50 years to see him." The president, solemn, proposed a ceremony, bipartisan, national press. Daniel listened, then replied, "Honor him by fixing the VA, rewriting training, closing loopholes. Don't pin a ribbon on a man who carried more than your stage can hold." He hung up, knowing James would never stand for applause over action. James, at home in Baltimore, hadn't answered the White House's calls. He sat on his porch, the repaired cane across his lap, Lena's photo in his heart, the boy's bandage in his pocket. He didn't know about the mall, the podium, the velvet box. He knew the wind's bite, the creak of his chair, the faint blue stain on his sleeve, a ghost of Ryan Wheeler's paint. Flashbacks flickered, 1971, Key San, 7 Boys Under Fire, 2005, Lena's Last Breath, 2025, A Child's Innocent Offer. He didn't want medals, he wanted a world that learned what he'd forgotten: dignity isn't shine, it endures. The ceremony began, the president's voice echoing over the mall. "We gather to honor James Carter, a man whose silence taught us strength." He paused, glancing at the empty chair, his tone faltering. A staffer, unprompted, placed a folded cap on the podium, James's, sent by Daniel, its olive green faded, the blue paint still faint, Combat Medic, Vietnam 1971 stitched in gray thread. A note tucked inside, in James's steady hand, read, "Don't award me. Erase the need for men like me to be remembered this way." The crowd hushed, cameras zooming in, the cap a gravestone for a nation's shame. The velvet box stayed unopened, the medal untouched. The president lowered his head, not in script, but in weight, the silence stretching longer than planned. The crowd didn't clap or cheer, they stood, heads bowed, a collective pause that felt like a tribute, more like a reckoning. News feeds clipped the moment, not with fanfare but with truth. James Carter refuses medal, leaves cap #surged, #no medals needed, #silence speaks, carrying the image of that cap into homes, classrooms, precincts. In Baltimore, a new clip surfaced, timestamped days after the ceremony. 8 seconds, no music, just James kneeling on a sidewalk, wiping his shoes with a rag, a faint blue stain on his sleeve. A girl, maybe 9, stood behind, her school uniform crisp, watching, still, not prompted but drawn, like the boy with the bandage. Her shadow fell across James, steady, learning not to salute but to honor. The clip didn't trend, it lingered, shared on X with captions like, "This is dignity when no one's filming." It played before Memorial Day events, silent, a calibration for a nation's noise. Daniel, mentoring veterans in D.C., saw the clip on a student's phone. He smiled, a rare break in his armor, remembering Lena's charge, "Fight for what lasts." He'd declined public roles, keynotes, panels, books, his work quiet, his name off letterheads. Flashbacks hit, 2016, resigning to protect veterans, 2025, James's porch, his father saying, "You don't need to fight, son. Just don't let them forget." Daniel hadn't forgotten. He pushed VA reforms, mentored more, his influence a ripple, not a wave, ensuring James's silence lived in policy, not podiums. James sat on his porch, unaware of the mall, the cap, the clip. A neighbor brought a candle, saying, "They're talking about you in D.C." James nodded, soft, setting it by his door. He held the cane, its crack a reminder. 1973, Memphis, a job denied. 1980, raising Daniels alone. 2025, a nation's eyes, too late. The girl's gaze in the clip, like the boy's bandage, was enough, a seed of seeing, not symbolizing. He didn't need their stage, he needed their sight, a world that held what he'd held, even when painted it broke. The mall emptied, the cap removed, but its shadow lingered, a warning not of glory but of debt. Schools aired the clip in civics, precincts trained with it, VA clinics circled it. James's silence wasn't a refusal, it was a lesson, etched in every policy shifted, every name restored. Daniel walked from a veterans class, his phone off, the city's hum enough. James leaned back in his chair, the wind carrying a truth he'd always known: honor isn't pinned, it's lived, and sometimes, it's just a shadow cast by a child who sees. James Carter's funeral was quiet, held in a small Baltimore churchyard on a July morning when the air hung heavy with summer's weight. He'd passed at 72, his heart finally resting after a second stroke, his cane by his bed, Lena's photo in his hand, the boy's bandage in his pocket. The crowd was small, neighbors, a few barbershop regulars, Daniel Carter, no press, no brass. At 45, Daniel stood by the grave, his suit plain, his eyes dry but heavy, carrying his father's silence as a vow. The headstone read, James Carter, 1953 to 2025, he stood, then held still. No medals, no titles, just truth. James hadn't wanted fanfare, and Baltimore gave him none. But his legacy bloomed, not in statues but in systems, quiet and enduring. Operation Unseen Valor restored honors to 2,000 veterans, names like his father's carved from bureaucratic shadows. Schools taught his story, not as a hero but as a mirror, what silence costs, what dignity holds. VA clinics expanded, revisit circles, families speaking names like prayers. In Pittsburgh, James Carter Hall hosted silent vigils, students learning pause before pride. His 8-second clip, kneeling, cleaning shoes, a child watching, played before national anthems, a nation's pulse slowing to match his. Daniel mentored veterans in Baltimore now, teaching them to lead without noise, his D.C. days behind him. He'd declined a Senate run, a book deal, his name off plaques. Don't teach what you survived, he told his students, teach what shouldn't be survived. Flashbacks lingered, 2005, Lena's funeral, James's hand on his shoulder, 2025, the empty mall chair, James's cap saying more than any medal. Daniel's reforms, VA funding, police training, honor audits, lived in budgets, not headlines, a promise kept to Lena, fight for what lasts. He visited James's grave weekly, leaving no flowers, just silence, a debt he'd never repay. Ryan Wheeler, 34, lived in obscurity, working nights at a warehouse, his name, painter, a whisper that followed him. He'd volunteered at a veterans shelter for 2 years, silent, earning no forgiveness, just presence. Flashbacks haunted him, 2025, Margaret's courtroom truth, James's porch, live with what you know. His mother, Margaret, was gone now, her army nurse badge buried with her, her last words to him, make it right. Ryan didn't seek redemption, he sought to carry the weight, learning, like James, that some debts are paid in quiet steps, not loud apologies. Across the country, empty chairs appeared, unprompted, in barbershops, libraries, town halls, signs reading, this seat's paid for, James Carter. No ceremonies, no hashtags, just places held for memory. In Baltimore's Fulton Street, the original chair stood by the barbershop, a wooden plaque etched, not for comfort, for honor. Kids paused by it, not knowing why, their elders nodding, that's for Mr. Carter. A new police academy module began with James's clip, teaching recruits to see before acting, to weigh a name's worth. A VA hospital in Memphis named a wing Carter's Rest, not for James but for silence that heals. James's legacy wasn't in bronze but in bylaw, budgets shifted, policies rewritten, names restored. He'd never asked for applause, only for the world to see what he'd seen. 1971, 7 lives saved. 1980, Daniel's first steps. 2005, Lena's last breath. 2025, a child's bandage, a nation's pause. His silence hadn't been surrender, it was a lesson, etched in every candle by his door, every sign on a chair, every policy that bore no one's name but carried his truth. Daniel stood by the grave one last time, the summer sun low, his shadow long. He didn't speak, didn't need to. James's voice echoed in his heart, "Don't let them forget, son." He hadn't. He walked away, mentoring a new veteran, teaching her to hold still, to carry weight, to listen. The churchyard was quiet, the city alive, and James Carter's name, lowercase, unadorned, stood taller than any podium, a fence between what was and what must never be again. To everyone who's walked this journey with us, thank you. You've stood with James through pain, silence, and triumph, feeling the weight of a man who never asked for glory but gave us truth. If his story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join us at Revenge Ties, where every tale, like every empty chair, holds a story of resilience, heart, and quiet strength. Like, share, comment, and keep carrying your own truth. We'll meet you at the next story, where dignity doesn't shout, but it's always heard.